Now, there's been an awful lot, as I said just before the news there, of rumours flying around that Shamima Begum was on her way back to this country or was secretly being smuggled into this country. I don't know where these rumours start, but let's say a very good morning to Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Rakib, very good morning to you.
Good morning,
Welcome
Mark.
back to the
Thank you for having me
studios.
again.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I don't know why this has happened over the last few days, but I was getting a lot of people on Twitter asking me, is it true that Shamima Begum's been somehow smuggled back into the country? And I can only assume that the rumour starts somewhere, gets a bit of credence on social media, and everybody starts asking people like me, is it true? What I do know is it's not true. And in fact, Priti Patel this morning has already said there's no chance of her coming back.
I think, to be honest, I feel that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, I think she's absolutely spot on this issue. I think the reality of the matter is, ultimately, her responsibility is to maintain the UK's domestic security. We're talking about someone who ultimately joined a jihadist, barbaric cult.
Yeah.
And ultimately, as I said, Priti Patel, she has to prioritise the security of British people.
Yeah, well, absolutely right. And also, she has to keep an eye as well on the ones who have already come back.
Absolutely.
Some of whom were fighters and some of whom were married to those fighters. So how do they do both of those things?
Absolutely. So at the moment, there are hundreds of people who have actually returned and they are walking the streets of Britain. So she very much has to focus on that, never mind actually taking a soft approach when it comes to the likes of Shamima Begum.
Yeah, right. But presumably now the law has to change because Boris Johnson has said, because the Americans have also said to our government, it would be good if you took responsibility for these people rather than leaving them where they are, where they might even do more damage. I mean, what's your view? Do you think they should be kept out of the country?
I think ultimately there's space for international cooperation in terms of how do we deal with such individuals. Perhaps that we could hold trials outside of the UK.
Right. Almost like a war crimes tribunal.
Absolutely, because the reality of the matter is there is no public appetite for the likes of Shamima Begum to return to our shores. And Priti Patel, her decision on the matter is very much in keeping with the general public mood on this issue. And it's high time that our politicians actually start listening to British people, and because there are cases where they haven't previously done that on a number of important issues.
Because, of course, the difficulty, I suppose, for the law-abiding Muslim community, which is the vast majority, of course, of the Muslim community in this country, Shamima Begum doesn't do them any favours.
Absolutely not.
Right?
It's disastrous for the general reputation of the broader British Muslim population. And this idea that, but she was 15 when she left, I think that's very disrespectful towards young British Muslim girls.
These are the same people that say we got to listen to Greta Thunberg.
Absolutely, and the reality is the vast majority of British Muslim girls who are currently attending school, they just want to further their academic ambitions. They want to do the best they can for their families and their community. So this idea that we should feel sorry for Shamima Begum purely on the basis of her age, because she left when she was 15, is absolute nonsense. We should also bear in mind that the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales is actually 10.
Yes.
So she's 5 years above that.
Well, exactly right. So how would you get to, say, from point A to point B, how would you get to the place where you could maybe have some kind of international court which people would sign up to? Would it be done through the UN? How would it work?
I think that there's definitely space for it, and perhaps it would be through international organisations. I think that is something that countries of the West, the unfortunate reality of the matter is this isn't exclusively a British problem.
No.
There are a number of Western countries.
Well, her husband's Dutch, isn't he?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, case in point. So there has to be more international cooperation in terms of how we handle this problem. But what I would say is that there's a shared appetite among those countries that those people do not return to those societies.
No, right. Which brings us on to an interesting piece you wrote earlier this week for Spiked Online about this new definition of Islamophobia, because, of course, that resonates an awful lot with this kind of story, doesn't it? Because where you have people reading about people like Shamima Begum and people going to fight for foreign countries in parts of the world where terrorism exists.
Absolutely.
There's an anti-Muslim discrimination law being brought in, effectively, but you're not happy with it?
I'm not happy with the working definition by the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, because I feel that that definition of Islamophobia, it dangerously conflates what we would consider hard forms of anti-Muslim prejudice, is dangerously conflating that with perfectly legitimate criticisms of religious ideology. Right. It's important not to mix the two together.
Is it interesting that you've got a law sort of defining something like Islamophobia in the same way that you've got one that defines anti-Semitism? Because we saw the Labour Party, for the last couple of years, struggling with the actual definition even of anti-Semitism. Yes. They can't even agree on what that is.
I think with this particular definition, what we'll say that the huge problem is, and I've analysed the definition. I've read the report produced by the APPG and British Muslims.
Yeah.
Is that it treats British Muslims as some sort of homogenous monolithic bloc.
Yeah.
The reality of the matter is, when we're talking about the oppression and victimisation of British Muslims, much of that is actually experienced within their own communities. And that's something that is missing from the report. And I would say that's a glaring omission. And that's something that we don't talk about much at all.
What, you mean they're discriminating against each other?
Absolutely.
So it's an example of that.
So, for example, we could talk about Ahmadiyya Muslims. They're a minority sect. And there are organisations such as the Muslim Council of Britain who have actually said that Muslims are not obliged to acknowledge Ahmadis as Muslims.
Right.
And we also had a case where there was a mosque in London, in our own capital, which is actually distributing leaflets saying that if Ahmadis do not, if they do not support orthodox interpretations of Islam, they should, within 3 days, face the capital punishment. Now, this is something going on within our British Muslim communities.
And I don't think anybody listening to this show would have probably heard of that ever before.
Absolutely not.
And
well, interestingly, the mainstream media aren't too keen to report.
Well, I don't know. I think maybe I think the problem is with a lot of media stories about Muslims is that a lot of media are terrified of being accused of being anti-Muslim or of somehow fanning the flames of hatred and all this kind of nonsense.
But Mark,
right?
we're talking about we're talking about a mosque which is distributing material, which is saying that if Ahmadis do not convert to their understanding of Islam within 3 days, they should face the capital punishment.
Yeah. They should be killed. They should be executed.
And this is on British soil.
Yeah. Well, why are they not being arrested? You see, my view of a lot of this is that there are already laws that cover that. You don't necessarily need an Islamophobia law to stop somebody from threatening another person on British soil.
This is just, quite frankly, this is absolutely horrendous case. Yeah. That's the fact of the matter. But if we're looking back at the definition itself, in my view, we had this, what I call an unholy alliance of clueless metropolitan politicians.
Yeah.
These crank left-wing academics who actually act like political activists.
Yes.
They're not serious
You've got a name
scholars.
for them, haven't you?
Yeah. Academivists.
Mix
of two.
Yeah. It's quite hard to say, but I quite like the word.
And with that, they actually communicated. I would go as far as saying collaborated with Islamist-backed organisations in this country, which poses these, good-willed civil society organisations. And they produced a definition which, in my view, is a blasphemy law through the back door. And we should be very worried about it.
And when are we actually looking at this coming into force in this country, this Islamophobia sort of law?
Well, interestingly, thankfully, the Conservative government rejected the definition, but the reality of the matter is, and other political parties have. So, interestingly, we do have a number of political parties who actually support the definition, which I think is quite worrying in itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, because also when you look at the Muslim world and you look at the Middle East, for example, an awful lot of the difficulties and the conflicts are caused because of the wars between the Sunnis and the Shias, right?
Absolutely.
And that's something which I presume doesn't bleed over into Europe,
well,
I
think what I would say is that those sectarian tensions, they do exist. And I think I gave you that case in point. That was, in terms of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK. I think what's really interesting, though, is that we have politicians such as Baroness Ida Warsi, Naz Shah of the Labour Party, Bradford MP. They try to portray British Muslims as a homogenous monolithic bloc. They think the same way on these sort of issues. The reality, that is not the case at all. We're talking about an exceptionally diverse population, which is diverse in terms of their political ideology, their social values. But we have these regressive politicians of different party colours who, for their own political agenda, seek to portray the wider British Muslim population as this sort of uniform community.
And they presumably want to point out to the Muslim community that they represent them in some way,
Absolutely.
shape or form.
These are the two individuals here that we're discussing. These are self-appointed spokeswomen.
Right.
That's what I call them. But they need to be called out.
Yeah. And what is the passage of this particular law at the moment then? Where are we with the Islamophobia definition?
I think that in terms of when we're looking at this particular definition, as I said, that we have local councils which have adopted the definition, we have political parties which have adopted the definition. But it is important to note that the Conservative government did reject the definition.
What do you think the definition should actually be?
I think that we need to focus on proven evidenced cases of anti-Muslim discrimination in markets. Particularly, we're talking about the labour market, access to social housing, but also in the rented sector.
Right.
I think those sort of issues. Looking at are there religious penalties that we need to address in our markets? And I don't think anyone would really be in serious opposition to that.
I don't think they would. But then again, do we not already have laws that cover that in terms of
I think that there's actually a strong
anti-discrimination?
case that there is existing legislation which can cover for that.
Yeah.
Now, but if people seriously want to focus on anti-Muslim discrimination, what they should do is just focus on that. What they shouldn't do is then delve into different matters and then try to almost clamp down on perfectly legitimate criticism of Islamic ideology, but also the social implications for the social implications of orthodox religious doctrine and what sort of impact that has in terms of things such as social integration in the UK and community cohesion.
That's one of the things that we saw in Birmingham at that school, wasn't it? Where you would have the Muslim community there, albeit maybe a small part of the Muslim community there.
Old Jez is quite big on LGBT rights and all the rest of it.
He was very quiet.
He was a bit quiet there, wasn't he?
Funny enough, when we covered that story, I said, for the left, this is a real problem because they don't know whether to support the LGBT lessons that are going on inside the school or support the Muslims.
Well, the thing is, Mike, when you go too much into identity politics, you start finding yourself in contradictory positions.
This is where it starts to get tricky because there is for me no real good reason why you need to have a law against Islamophobia in a way because you can argue that you might.
Mike, I have a problem with the term Islamophobia.
Yeah.
That's the reality. If you want to call it anything, I would use the phrase anti-Muslim prejudice.
Yes.
Because Islamophobia almost gives the insinuation that we live in a society where we shouldn't be allowed or entitled to criticise religious ideology.
Right.
We live in a free and open society. Being able to express views on the contradiction
if I want to
within
say, for
should be able
example,
to do that.
I want to say that some Muslim attitudes towards homosexuality I find to be pretty disgusting, and I don't think should be allowed in a modern Western world. I don't think I should be accused of Islamophobia.
Absolutely not.
But there would be those who would accuse me of that.
Of course there is. There'll be people they would want to use that very working definition to clamp down on that opinion. And I think that's deeply unhealthy for our democracy.
Yeah. And also what it does do, and I think a lot of people would bear this out on social media certainly, and probably some were already doing so, I haven't checked, it puts a lot of people's backs up when you make out that one particular group is suffering discrimination when some other groups are also suffering discrimination, but there's nobody championing their cause.
I think the interesting thing there, we can take it one step further. There's minority groups within the broader British Muslim population who are experiencing serious forms of oppression and victimization.
Yeah.
But because there's too many metropolitan politicians who have fallen into this trap of treating British Muslims as some sort of victimized monolithic bloc, they're missing those internal tensions and those internal cases of oppression. They have no understanding of it and they're ignoring it to their peril.
Absolutely.